So I want to welcome everyone on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day to our Department of Biostatistics seminar. So this is a day in which we commemorate and honor the life and the activism and the dreams of Martin Luther King Jr. And so this is a perfect day to be having this seminar. So in the spirit of this day, we're very honored and pleased to welcome our invited speaker, Professor Tukufu Zuberi. He is the Lasry Family Professor of Race Relations at the University of Pennsylvania, and has done many things. You can explore his very interesting website. He's the founder, among many other things, of the TZ Production Company and the writer, producer, and director of African Independence. Dr. Zuberi is dedicated to bringing a fresh view of culture and society to the public through various platforms, including this one, guest lecturing at universities, television programs, interactive social media, and exhibitions. He's been involved in, in the sociology department at University of Pennsylvania and has been very involved and given a lot of thought and written about issues of data analysis and what that all means. So Professor Zuberi will be speaking to us today on social statistics, science, propaganda, and fiction. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I would let me say a few words before I get into my talk, which is going to be defined by my talking about science, talking about propaganda, and talking about fiction and how they relate to social statistics. I continue to think of myself very much as a social statistician or a demographer or a person who applies statistical analysis to human beings. And as a consequence of that, I start off with a particular problematic. And that is when we think statistically, when we think about how to quantify the reality of Black, red, brown, and other bodies, and very much other in the sense that the process of statistical analysis has tended to other the non-white, that it becomes important to think through these things and to think through the logic we use to apply these numbers to society. So I kind of have a statistical starting point, and this is and it's not an equation, so, forgive me for that. It's MLK Day, so I try to keep this very text-based, but if you want the same argument in a very logical format using formal equations, there's a few articles that I've written and a book that I've written on the same topic. I'll try to give you some of the reference to those as we go along. So, I want to start by saying race is only a cause when the process of racial classification, or more clearly, the structure of racism, is the subject of investigation. Race is only a cause when the process of racial classification, or more specifically, the structure of racism, is the subject of investigation. And my simple example of this is being Black should not be understood as the cause of a test performance, despite the fact that being Black is a very reliable basis for predicting a test performance. You can take that test performance to be whatever you want to test. Well, let me say it one more time, because this is kind of a thing that's going to weave through all the other stuff that I say. I came up with this morning as I was going over my notes. I said it would be good to give you something to grab that you can then say I did or did not do that well as we go through this. Being Black should not be understood as the cause of a test performed despite the fact that being Black is a very reliable basis for predicting a test's performance. Now, my view of looking at statistical analysis is intertwined with the history and development of racism and colonialism in the world. Because a data revolution accompanied the kind of social transformations that led to the emancipation of enslaved Africans in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in the United States, and later on in Asia and parts of the Middle East. And it also accompanied the what you could call the social unrest in Europe and the neo-Europes, and what I mean by neo-Europes are places like the United States, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, New Zealand, Australia, all of these places where Europeans went and colonized and redefined these spaces within a Eurocentric context, which has had a profound influence on our the way we think, the way we imagine difference, the way we think we can study difference has been fundamentally influenced by these social processes that transformed our world. Because at the same moment when you were having these emancipations, which were towards the end of the 19th century, but at this same time, the world also witnessed a rise of colonialism in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and an increasing of social unrest for more democratic processes in most of Europe and these neo-Europes. Now, for me, World War II marked a definitive point when there was a redefinition of the world and who different people were and how they were classified and how they would have access to resources in the world. It's a very important moment. It was this moment, if you will, when Europe recognized that white supremacy could go so far that it would turn in on itself, and that white supremacists could end up colonizing Poland, colonizing France, and institutionalizing the same racist policies that they had been instituting with this colonialism in other parts of the world. This is kind of what I think is almost you have to understand that I'm thinking from this as my basis when I articulate what I think science is and what it can and cannot do for those who would study human beings. So I think that there has been the creation of a new national narrative, okay? A new international narrative. And that's the relationship of nations within themselves and nations among each other. And so for me, there are three structural processes that define power immediately before and after the Industrial Revolution and continue to be very essential for us in the creation of our articulation of these national narratives. And statistical representations is a very important part of this because the white logic, which has understood the way we have done methods, has been very important in reproducing and justifying the inequalities that we see in our world. And in many ways, those who use social statistics have either consciously or unwittingly supported this kind of racial stratification, which exists in every racially stratified society. Stratification exists in every society that indicates they have race and ethnicity. And we could talk about that a little bit more as we go along. But that's going to be the main subject of my talk. Now, other ways that I think this happens so that we have some kind of comparison across disciplines and across ways that people study it to get some form of consilience as to if we're studying something that's actually relevant and should be appreciated by us all, are in kind of how we memorialize our reality. whether it's in history or whether it's in what we think we came from. And so for me, this has meant curating museum exhibits and doing documentaries on different kinds of things, but where history and the ethnography of who we think we are as human beings becomes one of the subtexts we use to talk about the world that we have. So for me, these narratives that visually define our humanity, whether they be in fiction, whether they be in music, whether they be in documentaries, whether they be in our analysis, that it's very important that we put them within a particular context. Now, today I want to talk about that paradigm of statistics, that discourse, which we generally recognize as a kind of scientific achievement that provides model problems for the community of practitioners, whether it's economists, sociologists, epidemiologists, demographers, or biostatisticians. That is this moment that we exist in where statistical analysis is considered scientific and is considered so important. So this discourse, this statistical discourse, especially the social scientific statistical discourse, has been limited by a foundational logic of whiteness that has been guiding our application of these statistical methods. Often the math behind the methods is not problematic, because you have to take so many steps back to get to the mathematics, but that is not the problem as I see it. The problem is in how we interpret what these methods can do for us, okay? And in that way, I'm trying to think of the science of social statistics with these two caveats, that numbers do not talk to us. The numbers don't say anything. The numbers do not have a auto-interpretation. That in statistical analysis, we socially construct meaning for our numbers. You know what? I just realized I was gonna start showing my screen to you all. And all this time I haven't showed it to you. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen with you now. Is that okay? All right. Here, let me make that. Okay. Sorry for that technological mishap there. This is a statement from Ronald Fisher. And it's basically what I've tried to summarize for you. And let me try to restate it in another way. That social statistics are the analysis of numerical data by inferring proportions in a population from a representative sample, and pays less attention than is needed to the conditions of the correct applicability of social facts in the real world. We forget that we're dealing with social facts and somehow begin to think that our mechanization of these social facts is going to give us the meaning. And I'm trying to ask you to think that through with me, and it doesn't make any sense. It will lead us to another place. It is in these conditions of applicability. That's what I'm concerned about today. That's what I would like us to discuss today. Okay. Okay. So social statistics are the analysis of new, did I just say this? I think I did. Okay, well, let me go to the next thing. Why isn't it moving? Hold on. Oh, there we go. So my project on the science of the science of using statistical analysis to understand human populations began with my first project, which was a natural experiment of the mortality costs to people who leave their childhood disease environment and go someplace else. And this was my response to the literature on enslavement and the biodemography or epidemiology of what happened in enslavement and how that produced the attraction of having Africans as enslaved, and how I was trying to refute that and a lot of the numbers that people had been using for that. And then I offered a more general critique of social statistics and demographic methods as they are applied to issues of race. And I took that another step forward and tried to get a group of scholars to work with me in thinking this through, and to work with me and another colleague of mine, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's a professor at Duke, to rethink this, this process through, and a number of articles that have been published in the Annals and other places as well. Okay, what do I do? All right. So my critique is kind of based on the need to understand how race operates. It is not enough for me to just throw something away because it has been driven by a white logic, which is vested in the lack of my humanity, which has people thinking that the study of Negro problems is actually a study of the Negro, which is the backwards way to think about this, because the study of Negro problems has to be viewed as a study of the society and how it is creating a problem for those individuals who are Negroes. By the time you try to understand a propensity of an individual who is supposed to be of a particular racial category and how that is something about that individual that needs to change, you miss the larger point. And I want to drive us back to those larger points so that we understand how race operates. And I do this in the light of this particular quote that Du Bois had in his critique of statistics in 1899. And here we are in the 21st century, and some of these same points still persist. So let me break down what I mean by the social science of race. So then I think we will be able to see the flaw in the analysis that we use. And I want to focus more on the logic of the analysis that we use for the specifics of it, that is trying to get down to the breakdown of how you do one method to come, and then how do you interpret those results. Again, I say I've written that, but I'm more than willing to talk about that more when we get to the Q&A. So let me do this kind of quick. That race is not an illusion. To me, it's nonsense to say that race is an illusion, because the social reality of race, people feel that every day. That's what people have been in the streets about, talking about Black Lives Matter. They weren't talking about it because being Black is an illusion. They were talking about it because being racially classified as Black in a society puts a person at risk of being treated a certain way. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? I mean that race is not genetic. Race is not genetic. I really appreciated back in June of 2000 when they had this big thing at the White House, because they had just kind of assembled a working draft of the sequence of the human genome. And you had Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Francis Collins, Craig Ventura, all reconfirming the lack of a genetic basis of race. I was like, wow. I mean, you know, they said a lot of stuff, you know, humanity, the future of science and all that. And I heard that, you know, you had this group of people talking about here, what we've been engaging in at the highest level of understanding something about human beings has reconfirmed our idea that race is not a genetic factor. And I think that's important to start there, because there's a big return to looking and trying to find the root causes of racial differences in the genetic basis of that. And, you know, we get into all kinds of conversations where the epigenetic was the impact of the environment, kind of the great synthesis and what that means for this, the great, you know, all of that kind of stuff. Secondly, race is not a system of color. I know that's a hard one to swallow, but I think it's fundamentally important for us to understand how and why we need to see race as a social construction, and why we need to understand the purpose for this social construction. Why have we sustained it? And what are the reasons? What does it do for us in society? The idea of race as a system of color requires us to think with a white logic. It doesn't seem obvious at first, but it's true. and to confirm the white logic with irrational arguments, which we do all the time by calling people who are not white, white, and calling people who are not black, black, and calling people who are not yellow, yellow, and creating groupings of people that don't make sense in the space from which those people originate or the space in which we think their racial classification originates, like calling somebody an Asian rather than a Chinese, or an Asian rather than an Indian, or an Asian rather than this, or an African rather than that. I understand the need to do that because of the social need for it and the social significance of these racial classifications. Yet it doesn't mean that we're not operating within the sphere of a white logic which created these racial classifications. It was not created in Africa. It was not created in Asia. It was created in the European imagination within an ethnocentric interpretation that was driven and developed within the context of the modern university, the modern bureaucratic system, the modern cultural norms of how we look at social and human difference. So race is not a system of color. If black and white represented the extremes of racial colors, as some people try to think, then mixed people should not be brown, as is commonly referenced in many parts of the world, right? Because the ratio of white to black will determine whether the outcome is light, medium, or dark gray. Okay, no shade of gray is brown. The most significant social construction of skin color is the idea that people classified as white are superior. That's really what race is about. Now, it's easy to see it when we look at the science of it, right? Because scientifically, human visual perception of color comes from the stimulation of cells in the human eye by electromagnetic radiation in the spectrum of light. No, in the spectrum of light. You can't mix these two colors because white reflects all colors and black is the absence of color. So it is necessary that we have an ideological belief. We have an ideological belief that is illogical about race as skin color in order to make the social constructions of race that we use to fit people within those spaces in the hierarchy of the society. For me, I think it is important to say that race is socially constructed to facilitate inequality. Race is not socially constructed to help us understand human equality. It is a way to facilitate that equality and to sustain it. If we are not studying that as the process, as the mechanism, then we're studying or talking about something else. So for me, that means race is socially real, and this is that social reality. So racial categories are artificially defined by human beings using religion, culture, and physical appearance. It depends on when and where. Some people arriving in Britain are going to arrive there and they might be able to pass for white or not, but their culture or their religious distinction will prohibit that, and they will be raced by that. Some countries use these religious practices as a way to marginalize and oppress certain groups. Others use a notion they have about physical appearance as a way to create racial categories. So race is a hierarchical system of human relationships, a system arranged in order of rank. In a word, race is about racism. All race occurs within a national context, and all national experiences and all nations experience racial transitions. All right? Everybody with me there? Y'all still with me? Okay. So did I just get myself out of that? Wait a minute. Okay, hold on, everybody. Let me come back. Okay. So now I want to talk about propaganda or biased or misleading information and how that is used to promote or to publicize a particular political cause or point of view. And how does that operate in statistical analysis? All right, I see I left that part. Let me come back. I have to tell you this so you understand where I'm coming from. I grew up in Oakland, California, and I grew up at a time when the Black Panther Party was very active. And they gave me free breakfast, they gave me tests for sickle cell anemia, and they gave me a whole bunch of stuff that they were teaching. And one part of that was the teachings of Huey Newton. Huey Newton defined power in two ways. There are two dimensions of power. One dimension of power is the power to define. The other dimension of power is the power to manipulate the phenomenon so defined. And that stuck with me. It stuck with me because I started hearing it repeated over and over and over again, coming from so many different sources, old and new. But the power to racially define has some of these particular categories to it. Because racial classifications are used to define the rights of a class of persons. People are racialized in ways that define what they can do. So imagine if you have a war and the war is around those definitions and you redefine a group as free, and then there is a process by which you want to take those freedoms away. The process by which you take those freedoms away is how they are classified and how that classification is then used by the society. That's a definition of the Civil War in the United States, the brief process of Reconstruction, and the constitutional or the establishment, the constructing of Jim Crow and what became that in the United States. Or you could say the successful colonization of South Africa and the implementation of the apartheid policies within that particular context. Or you could discuss what happened after the revolution or the independence or the shift from a monarchy in Brazil at the end of the 19th century to their beginning of what they call the Second Republic. In all of these instances, the formerly enslaved were racially classified and stripped of their rights in ways that further justified the continuation of racial hierarchy within those societies. There was no need to redistribute anything because you justified the continuation by classifying certain groups of people as not deserving of being reconstituted, made whole within that society, whether they were enslaved or colonized by the process. So these counts, when we count the racially classified, we define them or we undefine them. Who can be colonized, who can be enslaved, or who can be otherwise marginalized is based on how we use these counts and their place within the context of the society. Okay, how are we doing on time? Are we good?
Yes, you have, it's 1 o'clock, so plenty of time.
Okay, plenty of time. All right, okay. All right, good, because I have plenty more to say. Systems of racial classification are time and place specific. We can use the examples I just gave for Brazil, South Africa, and the United States. Or if you look just at a country like the United States, you see how there have been a number of transitions about what we call race, a number of transitions of what we call an enslaved person, what we call a Negro, what we call a Black person, what we call an African American, what we call all of these different groups. And they change, and who is in the group changes. I mean, what do you do with a Black person who is the child of immigrants from, let's say, Brazil and Colombia? And even if those parents are Black, is that person a Black Latino? Is that person Black? Because the Black Latino is only relevant because of their immigrant status in the United States, and a Black Latino definitely doesn't exist in Brazil, and it doesn't exist in Colombia. The Black person in Colombia or in Brazil are racially classified as Black within the context of those societies. and what it means in those societies. When they shift and move to the United States, now the question of what Latino means and what Black means converges in the context of what the United States wants to use race for and how it uses it in those classifications. Hence debates on what you do in censuses, what you do at borders, et cetera, and so forth. Now, there's a certain aim at which this propaganda, you know, and if you recall, let's just recall, because now I realize I didn't have this showing, but I was saying propaganda is the bias or misleading information used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Race is a political cause, and it is a point of view. There is nothing about racial classification that is in fact based on the physicality of what race is supposed to mean. It is a social construction, but social constructions are important. Banks are social constructions. We don't refute the importance of the thing because it's a social construction. It just makes it a different thing than a biological thing. And you have to treat it differently than you treat a biological thing. But, you know, usually when decision makers, and a lot of us like to think we're talking to decision makers, I'm not quite sure that happens. They listen sometimes, especially if what we say comports with what they want to do. Decision makers want causal models that address important questions. And it is the misuse of the models by scholars that makes the process problematic. If we give them what they want to fit the narrow notion of their political exigency at the particular moment, then we are participating in it. And if there is a racial hierarchy which needs justification, it needs political articulation, we need to say how this is not a result of the society. Other words, get about changing the society and not a result about those particular individuals and looking at them and blaming the racial process or the race effect on the particular individuals. Because when we think of effects in this way, when we think causally about these statistical methods that we're using and we think of the effect of race, we are less mindful of the larger world in which the path to success or failure is routinely influenced by other contingencies or other circumstances. Okay. I'm going to do a fictional conclusion. Excuse me for the length of my conclusion, but I think it's my effort to bring this all back together and then hoping that it keeps the technical side of it, but allows us to venture a little bit into fiction. Now, this is a book by Ralph Ellison, a quote from a book by Ralph Ellison that he wrote in 1947. Actually, it's the first paragraph of a book written by Ralph Ellison in 1947 called The Invisible Man. Now, there are 3 points here about what an invisible man is that I want to suggest has been part of the great social science fiction about race, because in my mind, it perfectly defines how and what approach we have used to analyzing social reality. And the quote goes like this, and I'll read it to you for dramatic effect. I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fibers and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorted glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. I often think that this quote, I am an invisible man, it really takes me back to what people consider the first science fiction book, which is Frankenstein. And I don't know if you all remember Frankenstein, but there's a point in the book that you should understand, first of all, that the monster is not Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the scientist. There's a point in the book when he's tasked with defining and naming the monster, and he can't name the monster. He cannot name the monster. The humanity of the monster escapes him, and that's problematic. So social scientists, as Dr. Frankenstein, played with genetic material to piece together a monster worthy of our collective concern and deliberation. Now, his monster was the perfect other to be feared. He couldn't name it. It was always confused in his mind, and he couldn't get it right, but it was something that it did that made the situation worse, just by not achieving the human status. And indeed, this may have been one of the metaphors that Shelby was working with. We're not quite sure, but the implications and the interpretation we can have of it today is it fits very nice within that space. Social scientists play Dr. Frankenstein with genetic algorithms using so-called genetic markers to explain social realities and relations like crime and birth patterns or infant mortality patterns. I once had a long conversation with some individuals in the pages of the journal Demography about using ideas of race to understand infant mortality. But this was them, in my mind, they were playing Dr. Frankenstein because they reified what race was about. They used antiquated ideas about race in their analysis, thinking that that was not important. So we social statisticians, we people who try to apply statistics to the understanding of humanity, we construct the racially marginalized as one of our Hollywood movie ectoplasmic aliens from another more barbaric place in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. They are someone else. They are something else. And this is a fiction that moves social science away from helping resolve the problem and may have been the reason that we are part of sustaining the problem. By reifying race through our analysis, we appear to be solving problems when in reality, we only help define those problems. Fiction in social science number 2. So social scientists, social statistician, people who use and apply statistics to the study of human beings, as Dr. Frankenstein, the optometrist, or Dr. Frankenstein as an optometrist. Social scientists normally give lip service to the idea that race is socially constructed. Not many people fight this idea anymore. Yet few see beyond the color myths that help our bodies become things, right? When social scientists study the racially marginalized, they see only the subject's surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination, indeed everything and anything except other human beings. Understand, if you only see the surroundings of someone, you have not seen them. You've seen the circumstances in which they're in, which is why you don't have perfect predictability, because people in a particular circumstance, they're going to come out a certain way. We don't see them. We see figments of our imagination. Hence, if we have biases, if we have racial biases, racial distortion, I don't care where they came from, that is going to influence what we see. Because the numbers cannot talk alone, they need us to interpret them. How we interpret them is going to be based on our ideas. And indeed, all of these kinds of things, which we could classify as pre-existing biases, a priori understanding of what these people are, hence their potential and the range of space that they could operate in, we see everything except for the humanity in them, except for the ability to really empathize with how do we help solve this problem, which is reproducing and recreating itself generation after generation. This is the social scientists as predictors of the future. It's my fiction in social science number 3. Now, social scientists normally research as if they believe in whites and blacks as races as opposed to people. This is an essential thing in order to maintain a white logic. You need to be able to find the racial groups. Even if, say, you get somebody who is classified as an Asian, whatever you think that is, and classified as a Black, whatever you think that is, their child must fit in some kind of racial configuration. So you may, because of your desire to find some consistency, think of that person as mixed. If in fact they are mixed, you must reify what race means in order to have the mixed person. That is, you must believe in the racial groups in order for the person to be mixed. In other words, we're all mixed. But mixedness, racial mixedness, necessitates having a certain logic about who is who. How is a person a white person? How is a person an Asian person? How is a person whatever racial classification that we give them, and then we, at a priori, now we come back and we try to give that characteristics which meet our definition. It doesn't happen the other way. That's why they failed with the Human Genome Project to find the genetic markers of race. Okay, we know the genetic markers that lead to the pigmentation in people's skin and these kinds of things, but that has nothing to do with race. When social scientists predict the future, the racially marginalized are invisible, understand, simply because social scientists refuse to see any reality that is not white. Any reality that is not whatever they define as the white for the society in which they are in. To me, this is particularly problematic because demographers, as you know, they tend to want to predict the future. They like to say, this is what's going to happen. If the population continues in this particular way, then we will have this. If people continue to die, have births, and immigrate, or migrate in or migrate out of the country in these particular rates, this is what the population will look like in 2030. This is what the population will look like in 2050. This is what the population will look like in 2200. And the reason we do that is based on some notion of being able to constitute the population in these future projections. Now, these constructions in themselves are always based in our notions of how we constitute the space that we're talking about. If we're talking about the human population, there's no need to talk about the different nations. But once we go down into the nation states, then it becomes, it is in itself defined by how we define that nation state. And within that nation state, we may have divisions. We may think of some populations as being majorities and some of them as being minorities. And that does not always mean that the group's numbers are the minority or the majority. South Africa is a case in point. Brazil is a case in point. The US is a contrast in point. And so how we understand what the future will be is very firmly gripped by the logic of what we think the society is now. How many non-white people will there be in the US in 2030? How many non-white people will there be in the US in 2050? People are writing books on the number of mixed people they will be in the future. They're writing books on the number of mixed people there are now. They're writing books on the number of non-white people there will be in the future, the number of Latinos there will be in the future in the US, the number of Black people there will be in the future in Brazil, the number of white people there will be in South Africa. These are things that people are thinking and writing about. And through this process, they are reifying what we think the population is. Rarely do social scientists do research in order to predict things in the past, like my natural experiment I did with Swing Low, Sweet Cherry. That's not usually what we're doing. We are doing social science to talk about things that we think will happen in the future. How can we learn from what we study about the immediate past, so-called present, or the further past to understand how our behavior, how our world, how our society will look in the future? We're very interested in these predictions. The predictions require us to make certain statements about the now. Even if we want to make counterfactual arguments, these counterfactual arguments are based in how we define the now. So how we define who we are has a big impact on how we define what we can be. The number of people in poverty. Who are these people? What is the characteristics of these people? How have these people been racialized by the society? And how does the society use this racial classification in order to recreate the differences that we see? Okay. So this, I think, is the problematic of how race This is the problematic of how race has been used in society, how we continue to use it in society, and how it has been conceptualized as a problem, and we use statistical analysis to understand it. Okay. And I think I wanted to stop about there.
So thank you so much. So we've gone over our time. This was a fantastic talk and incredibly thought-provoking for all of us. And I'm sure we could continue all day, but I think we will stop now. So thank you again, Professor Zuberi, for a fantastic talk.
Thank you all for giving me your attention. I appreciate it.
Take care, everyone.